Hi, my name is Haley, and today I'm going to be leading you through an overview of the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras are one of the most important sacred texts in the world, and of course one of the most important when it comes to studying yogic philosophy. Now, even though you may be listening to this video, taking notes, it's really important to take a moment to ground in before we start to absorb this knowledge. And that's because the nature of yogic information is such that we really want to take what we learn beyond our brain and into the body to learn what Patanjali, our author, shares with us in a very felt and lived way. So I invite you to meet me in a comfortable seated position. Welcome to sit on a cushion or a blanket. And just bring one hand to your heart and one hand to your belly. Take an inhale to sit up tall and an exhale to relax the shoulders down the back. Gently closing the eyes, coming into the breath and feeling the rise of the belly, the fall of the belly. Connecting deeper to this flow of life. Inhale and exhale. And when you're ready, set an intention for this lesson. The intention I'll offer today is deep listening. Listening with all our senses. The intuition, the spirit. With the intention of deep listening in mind, take a gorgeous inhale. And a full exhale. Take one more breath here. And as you exhale, allow the hands to fall, collecting them in the lap. And gently blinking the eyes open. And our practice has now begun. So what are the Yoga Sutras? Well, yoga, in one of its most traditional translations, means union. This is an expansive way of looking at union. It's union with something greater than ourselves, with the capital S self, the divine, God. And sutras means threads. Specifically, these threads are referring to the 196 aphorisms that make up the text. These aphorisms are essentially short statements or sentences that provide insight into yogic wisdom as well as instruction. So Yoga Sutra is the union of the threads. You can think about it as when you weave all these lifestyles, practices, perspectives together, that is when you achieve yoga. And also what this text is really rooted in is this idea of dissolving separation. So again, coming back to that idea of union. So when you can weave the threads, the sutras, together, that is when instead of seeing yourself as, for example, me as Haley, someone separate from you watching this, separate from this altar, this book, instead the separation is dissolved, so we recognize ourselves as infinite beings who are all, who are nothing, who are everything. So that's what Yoga Sutras means, already a big concept to take on in the title, of course. And this text is offered to us by Patanjali, who was a sage who lived from about 3 to 5 BCE. The sutras are written somewhere in that timeline because we're looking so far back, we don't have exact dates. But 3 to 5 BCE, that's our rough estimate. It is theorized that Patanjali is perhaps not one person, but a group, or that maybe Patanjali's students came together to put the sutras into one clean format for us to read. However, for the sake of clarity, we usually just refer to Patanjali as one person. Now, one thing that you will notice in this book is that it is very numerical. There's a lot of categories and subcategories. It's very organized. And that is because Patanjali studied with the Samkhya Yoga school, or the enumeration school, which had a big focus on lists, essentially numbering things. So that's something to keep in mind as you go through the sutras, as well as the fact that this is not the first pathway that we're offered towards yogic living. In fact, in the grand scheme of yogic history, this text comes relatively later, which is part of the beauty of it as well, because Patanjali was able to take perspectives from Hatha yoga traditions, Ashtanga yoga traditions, ascetic traditions, and bring them all together in one text, which is part of also why this has withstood the test of time, because it's very palatable for a wide audience. The sutras appeal to many different types of yogis, and that made it really take off in the BCEs. Another good thing to note about why we study it so much now, especially in the West, and usually this is going to be the first text you get introduced to when you're going into more formal yogic study, is because Swami Vivekananda, who's one of the people who was most influential in bringing yoga to the West, really loved this text, and it was an integral part of his teachings. So it's a little context about where this all comes from. Now, what are the sutras really talking about? Well, the book is broken into 4 padas, or chapters, detailing the 8-limb path to yoga. So this is where you notice that Samkhya influence. 8 limbs, 196 aphorisms, 4 padas. It's very organized. The 8-limb path is essentially a series of steps towards yogic living. However, the reason that they're referred to as limbs is because it's important to view these concepts as working holistically. So in the same way that you couldn't really say whether my arms are more important than my legs, but that the body works as a whole, so do the limbs. Like the sutras need to be weaved together, the limbs need to be weaved together to achieve yoga. The first limb is yama. These have to do with our outer observances and the way that we operate within the world. One of the most famous yamas, for example, is ahimsa, which means non-harm. And you'll notice here that rather than telling us to be kind or good, Patanjali instructs us to do no harm. And that's really part of the beauty of the yogic path, is that there's a lot of freedom and a lot of choice, because it is the path of self-realization. So no matter what you do, as long as it does not cause harm, you're in alignment with ahimsa, one of the yamas. There are 5 yamas. For the sake of being concise, we won't get into all of them today, but ahimsa is a really great one to start with. In yoga communities, this is also often why we see a lot of vegans and vegetarians, because their way of practicing non-harm is by not eating animals. From the yamas, we move to the niyamas, and these are really about how we are citizens in our own bodies, how our inner world operates, and our inner observances. Yama, outer observances, niyama, inner observances. A niyama that I love is saucha. This translates to cleanliness. So of course, we're talking about literal cleanliness, keeping ourselves clean, taking care of our bodies. This is often why you're asked to take shoes off before you enter a yoga shala. It's a way of maintaining and honoring saucha in your practice and in your practice space. However, like everything in the sutras, the practice of saucha goes a lot deeper. So this is also about the purity of our mind and our thoughts, what we consume. So you can think about your interaction with your phone and social media. If you scroll through your social media all day and you take in a lot of violent images or things that bring you down, you find yourself getting into this comparison mindset, that's not really practicing saucha, because you're not keeping your mind, quote unquote, clean of these unhelpful thoughts. On the other hand, if your feed is filled with really inspiring images, and maybe you build communities through your social networks or stay in touch with loved ones, then you're absolutely practicing saucha because you're keeping positivity in your mind. So again, coming back to that idea of freedom here, it's not that the phone is good or bad, it's our interaction with it and our observance of the saucha within our minds and our bodies as we take in things from our surroundings. So it's one of the niyamas. And there are also 5 niyamas. From the yamas and niyamas, we move to what is now probably the most famous limb, which is asana. What is asana meaning? Posture. And what's interesting about this is, even though modern yoga is usually advertised to us as being very physical and focused on the poses, there's actually only 3 sutras written about asana in the Yoga Sutras. And these really have to just do with how you sit in meditation and keeping the body comfortable enough that we're able to focus on expanding our awareness of the divine within, with that sense of something greater. So though I love and teach asana, as I'm sure many of you do, and it's a wonderful practice, it's also really important to know that it's not the be-all end-all of yoga. It's really just a small slice, and in fact a stepping stone to something far greater, deeper, and found internally. From asana, we move to pranayama, which translates to breath control, or the translation that I prefer is life force expansion. So prana means life force. Every living thing has prana. It's not actually the breath itself, it's carried on the breath, but it exists in everything from people to animals to plants. Even the foods we eat have a certain prana. Yama means expansion. So life force expansion, pranayama. And if you think about it, when we start to control the breath, we start to be able to, of course, breathe deeper. So expand our prana in that literal way, because when we're taking fuller inhales and exhales, we are expanding our prana. But also it's about the direction of our energy. If you've ever been really anxious, for example, and someone says, take a deep breath, and then you take that deep breath and you feel better, that's because through pranayama and directing your breath, your prana, your energy, you've been able to shift your mood. And when we start to come really deeply into the breath and come into that pure place of just our divine essence, that is when we get to really feel our prana and be within our prana as our truest state of being. So the first 4 limbs, yama, outer observances, niyama, inner observances, asana, posture, pranayama, life force expansion. By the way, the reason you usually breathe at the beginning and maybe even the middle of your asana yoga classes is because you're practicing pranayama, even if your instructor doesn't necessarily call it that. It's just a tip. But rewind. So our first 4 limbs are a lot more apparent, whereas when we move into the next 4, they become much more subtle. I like to think of pranayama, of the breath, as the bridge between the physical realm and the spiritual one. So if you've ever had a really incredible meditation or breathwork session, you've probably experienced that point where everything around you kind of just seems to fade away. The outer world tunes out and the inner one tunes up. And that sensation, that experience of the fading, is the 5th limb, pratyahara, which means sense withdrawal. So that moment where what you see, what you hear goes away, and then you find what you're left with, which is really when we get to that good point of meditation, right? That thing we love. What we're left with is the self, or at least a glimmer of that divinity within us. So pratyahara means sense withdrawal. From pratyahara we move to the 6th limb, which is dharana, and then the 7th limb, which is dhyana. Now I teach dharana and dhyana as a pair because they really lead, dharana leads to dhyana, and they're deeply connected. Dharana means concentration. Dhyana means meditation. A key difference here is that dharana is something you can do, whereas dhyana is a state of being. So for example, if you ever worked with mantra meditation, where you're repeating a phrase over and over again in your mind, you are practicing dharana by concentrating on that phrase. Over time, through sincere concentration, you will be led into dhyana, meditation, which isn't something you do, but a state of being that you come into naturally. A lot of academic texts will say it spontaneously arises after a practice of dharana. So this is also what we mean when we say that the last 4 limbs are much more subtle than the first 4, because now we're in a higher, more spiritual realm where we're working more with states of being than step-by-step practices. If you spend enough time in dhyana, what will hopefully happen is that you will reach the 8th and final limb, samadhi. And this is bliss, this is enlightenment, this is yoga. The moment where our sense of separation disappears and we come into union with the all. Now, there are some schools of thought that believe samadhi is not actually the last step in achieving union, or that we experience samadhi in little bursts in our meditation practice, but that doesn't mean our journey is complete per se. However, for today, we won't get into all the theoretical debate, and we can just leave it there with samadhi being the eighth and final limb, the achievement of the ultimate bliss state, which is our truest way of being. It always exists within us and around us. So those are our 8 limbs. You can go over them one more time. Yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. As I said at the beginning of the video, these work holistically together in the same way that the limbs of the body do. So as much as, of course, we're working on the Samkhya philosophy, we're going step by step, it's really best to take a holistic approach to a lifelong practice through the 8 limbs. And now, there are also certain ways that Patanjali advises us on how to interact with the Yoga Sutras. One recommendation that's made and that I absolutely endorse is taking your time when you're reading this text. So as you can see, my copy is well worn and well loved, and that's because it's been on many adventures with me, and I really took my time to go through each and every sutra, every page, every pada, chapter. Because of the nature of this knowledge, it's meant to be lived, to be understood, not simply read. If we could just read this book and then become enlightened, well, why wouldn't we all just read it as soon as we could read, right? So, read it slowly. The other thing that I love to drive home with students is that you actually don't need to read it. And Patanjali himself tells us this in the 2nd sutra. The 2nd sutra is Yogash Chitta Vritti Nirodha. That's Yogash Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which translates to yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. So Patanjali tells us what yoga is, and the only thing we have to do to achieve it is to, quote unquote, simply, these are said and done, clear the mind. If you can truly calm your mind, no mental waves, no thoughts, no nothing, and see what you're left with, you will achieve yoga. And that's all you need to know. Of course, for most of us, that is not all we need to know. So that's why we then are given 194 more sutras to give us advice. However, always come back to that 2nd sutra. Whenever you practice, whenever you wonder what you are doing, why you are doing it, come back to that, and it will give you a lot of wisdom, I hope. So those are our Yoga Sutras, an amazing book. There are many different translations. So like I said, the original text is written in Sanskrit. So because of that, it's really nice to check out a few copies by a couple different translators. I know this version I have is pretty popular. It's by Sri Swami Satchidananda, but you'll get a different perspective from every translator that you pick, and in that way you can really expand your knowledge of what the sutras means, as for most of us, it's not realistic necessarily to learn the entire Sanskrit language, although it is really good to get a strong hold on how to pronounce Sanskrit words, and of course to learn essential terms such as, each of the 8 limbs, each of the yamas, each of the niyamas. So that's something else I would really recommend as you begin your studies with this text, or perhaps continue them. Now we can close our session just as we began by finding a comfortable asana, comfortable seated position, and bringing this time both hands to the heart. Take an inhale, fill the belly with prana, and let it go. Close the eyes. Start to draw attention to the breath, inviting in pratyahara, letting everything else drift away, practicing dharana on the rhythm of the inhale and the exhale. Sending gratitude to Patanjali for the lineage of teachers who have passed these sacred words down to us. Sending gratitude and love to the self for expanding our awareness and for taking the first steps towards union. One more inhale. One more exhale. Our lesson is now complete. Welcome to let the hands come off of the body or close your practice in any way that feels right to you. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a beautiful day and a great time reading. Thank you so much.